You were first drawn to therapy when your uncle committed suicide, and that was a decision that you made to go into therapy at that point.
I was at a crisis point. I mean, I was just stranded in Paris, and I remember every time I stood on a platform, drawn to like jumping over the edge, and I kept looking down into water under bridges and things like that. That was the kind of feeling at that time.
And your experience with that therapist was?
Coldness, just like no understanding, no empathy. Going there and just saying how I felt, but then not having any comfort or compassion or...
Do you feel that therapy is useful? That the traditional therapeutic model, and here I'm maybe specifically talking about talk therapy, I guess. Do you feel it's useful?
I haven't found it to be that useful. Most of the time, I can't even identify what's going on because it's so deep in the subconscious. Everything's so suppressed. Everything's inaccessible.
I feel the same. I feel like there is some purpose to talk therapy. I don't discount it entirely, but it feels like it would take many, 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 many years with a very good therapist to get anywhere near the source of the problem. I sat myself with so many therapists who, looking back now, I see were deeply wounded themselves. I mean, did you feel that often you were sat with someone who was deeply wounded themselves and who was hiding that from themselves by setting up this patient-therapist model and calling themselves the therapist?
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely felt that. When I went to see my therapist in Berlin, by the end of it, I could see that she was the one who needed the therapy. And I was just, I don't know, I felt quite exploited in a way because it just felt like there I was doing all the work, experiencing all the feelings, which is always the hardest thing. And it just felt like the therapist is there using you to work through her own feelings. Felt like it was maybe more useful for her to have someone there to experience the feelings that she wasn't feeling for herself.
I've definitely sat with therapists who have outsourced their own feelings to me as the alleged patient. It's interesting, the word patient, because the word patient means waiting without complaint. I think that's pretty much what a lot of people in therapy do. To take the linguistic constructs to the next level, I also think it's very interesting, and I think Freud would probably have agreed because he was very big on looking at the latent meaning behind words and dreams. But the very word therapist, the rapist, does make me wonder whether or not effectively a lot of us are sitting with symbolic replacements for the person who abused us as a child. As we talked about in the previous podcast, Freud discovered all his female patients had been abused, sexually abused. It does interest me, the language we use, that essentially you have the rapist or therapist, and you have the patient, the one who waits without complaint. And it feels like the dynamic itself might be deeply flawed. I know J.M. Masson, whose book, The Assault on Truth, we talked about in the last podcast, he called psychotherapy the dark art. It's also interesting when you separate the words psycho and therapy. You get an interesting new perspective on what might be going on. That might sound a little harsh, and I agree it's not a blanket statement. I have had therapists that have been good. Very few, though. I would agree that it is a dark art, and with a few practitioners who practice the light version of that. And by light, I mean the good, true, compassionate version of that. You had an experience with one of your therapists where you explained to her that you had been sexually abused throughout your childhood. And what was her reaction to that?
I mean, I was in a crisis and I reached out to my mother because I didn't know what to do and I felt completely lost. She came over to Berlin. We actually had a therapy session with this therapist together. The therapist advised my mother to go back to my father.
So a professional therapist in Berlin with presumably some kind of certification. On learning that your father had sexually abused you throughout your childhood, she advised your mother to return to him.
Yeah, well, my mother hadn't left him at that point. She just left him to go to Berlin. I mean, I was basically advising my mother never to go back to the UK, to my father, to stay here with me and to help me. Really, I think I just wanted her to help me like she never had when I was a kid. It felt like she trusted the therapist more than me, and she went back to the UK.
See, this is confusing for me and probably for many listeners. So a professional therapist, on being told that a man had raped a child many, many times throughout that child's childhood, did she recommend you go to the police?
No.
She recommended that your mother return to your father. Did she recommend that you speak out about what happened?
No.
Why do you think that was?
It felt like she had probably experienced similar abuse when she was a child.
Had you talked about the sexual abuse previously in therapy sessions with her?
Yeah. And I mean, I always felt like I never really felt understood in a way, and it was very hard because I was having really severe flashbacks and feelings and just very extreme states, and she would always just tell me things like, oh, you should make a lavender tea and have a bath, and I was like, this is just not going to help me, you know, it's just not helping me right now. This is just pathetic advice. You know, you say that to someone if they've been caught out in the rain or something, like not been violently abused so many nights in their childhood. And it just felt like when my mother got there, you know, she basically completely took over. The therapist was also very much happy to take the side of my mother.
Do you think it's a danger that many therapists haven't faced their own abuse experiences as a child, and then they sit with certificates in rooms presiding over an experience which is supposed to be healing, whilst they actually don't want to address the problem?
Absolutely. That's just a fundamental problem, because I don't see how you can help anyone with something that you don't even understand in yourself. It's like a teacher teaching maths who had never studied maths. You know, like it doesn't work.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a massive problem in our society with therapists who don't want to address the problem. I think the challenge is that most of these therapists study in institutions that also don't want to face the problem. I think it's very dangerous in a society to be a therapist that actually helps people, because if you start actually helping someone, then you start uncovering the truth of that society, then you come into conflict with that society.
And that was definitely clear with the therapist that I saw in Berlin. She was very happy to have her lovely therapist studio, you know, and which is understandable. I guess everyone wants to have a certain quality of life, but it's true, because once you start unraveling these things, your whole worldview falls apart. A lot of people don't take that road because it's hard.
I remember things got so bad with your therapist in Berlin. You came to me and you said that you felt like the therapist was uncaring in terms of how she advised your mother to return to a man who was sexually abusing children, that you felt like there needed to be some sort of intervention. And I went with you to your therapist and we confronted her about her behaviour.
I felt very scared when I came up to confront her, I guess, because I sensed a lot of anger in her.
It felt as though she started malfunctioning.
Yeah.
I didn't really say anything to begin with. I was just sat in the room with you guys, and it felt like she sensed that the game was up. I remember hardly saying anything, and she became absolutely obsessed with me being in the room. And what I also observed, and I don't know if it was typical of your therapy sessions, but when you began to speak, she almost immediately started speaking over you.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true, and I guess that was something that was a theme of the therapy sessions. Ultimately, I was there to speak. It was a therapy session, and very invasive to be talking over someone, especially as a therapist. I think at a certain point, you brought it to her attention.
Because I thought what she was doing was dangerous, as in advising those who are living with those who are sexually abusing children to go back to those people. I mean, let alone advising them not to report it to the police, but advising them to go back into the same space as these violent individuals. I felt that was so dangerous that it warranted a total confrontation. And I said to her very clearly, I think what's happening here is that you were abused as a child and you're avoiding that by being a therapist and by telling people to return to their abusers because you haven't faced it in yourself. Do you remember her reaction to that?
I remember her reaction. I just remember it was like a cartoon. It was like her eyes were bulging. I didn't realize that could actually happen to a person until I saw it with her, and I was like, oh my god, she's like a cartoon, like with her eyes bulging. But it was quite scary. Yeah, she just lost it then, and she told us to get out, didn't she? Yeah. She
opened the door to her room and essentially kind of pushed us out the door, basically. I think what was most interesting about that is her office was full of mindfulness posters that basically said, be calm, breathe, these kind of mantras. And yet here she was shouting at us essentially to leave. Because I think what we'd done is finally, and I don't know if it had an impact on her, I hope it did, finally someone had said to her, stop. By doing this, you're abusing people.
Yeah.
As a therapist, by telling people to return to the abuser, you are abusing people. It terrifies me how many people she might have given that advice to, or how many people sit patiently in that room while she essentially ignores the problem in them or gives them advice that's harmful, because she is the one who requires therapy. She is the one, well, probably not therapy because it doesn't really work, but she is the one who requires like self-reflection. Yeah, I think it's very easy for, and I think this is a massive problem in the medical community in general. I think it's very easy to take on these roles of doctor, patient, therapist, patient, in order to have a position of authority and control, to give yourself the impression that you do understand what's going on, whereas so often the therapist is the one who really needs the help, who really needs the support. And I say that with a sense of love. I took no joy in confronting your therapist, other than I hope that it had an effect on her, and I hope it means that she doesn't do to other people what she did to you. But how did you feel after the confrontation when we were sort of thrown out onto the street?
I felt very shocked because I felt like I hadn't seen this side to her before. Or well, I guess I'd felt it, but I'd always been playing into her dynamic that she'd created. It was only until after we questioned that whole setup that her real self exploded. I mean, I remember afterwards she actually wrote an email to me, and that was very insulting in a way, because she basically was saying how she felt like I was unstable and like that I needed more help and stuff like this. So like, again,
interesting projections there. Yeah. I mean, that is the problem with the power dynamic, isn't it? I mean, luckily we live in slightly more enlightened times, but I can imagine like 100 years ago, you confront a therapist like that and they're like, this woman's hysterical, put her in an institute. I feel like we've evolved slightly from there, but there's still echoes of it.
Yeah.
There was nothing for the therapist.
She was saying, yeah.
Right. There was nothing for the therapist to confront in themselves, but you were unstable because she had shouted at us and thrown us out on the street. You were unstable. It's amazing. It's amazing the incredible gymnastic acts these people perform in order to retain their sense of power and control in the face of the obvious falseness of so much of what they're doing. What I also felt was interesting is that therapy session, or that alleged therapy session where we confronted her. I think it lasted about 10 minutes, and she sent you a bill. In response, I sent her a bill for the same amount for a therapy session for her, because I believe what we participated in there was a direct intervention against a very abusive act performed by someone who was allegedly supposed to be helping people. And I hope that had an effect on her. She hasn't paid the bill yet. This question leads on from that experience, and it is, do you feel like most therapists are wounded?
They're scared, you know? Like one therapist that I spoke to, she seemed kind, but it felt like this topic of ritual abuse scared her. She said that she needed to think about herself and her own sense of safety, and if she wanted to enter into it with me, which, I mean, I'm glad that she was clear about that, but I felt it was very disappointing because, I mean, it's her job as a therapist to help patients, even with extreme stories. And
you feel like a lot of therapists are scared of confronting your story, your experiences.
Another therapist that I went to, she, in theory, was able to treat ritual abuse because she'd worked at a clinic which dealt with dissociative disorders. She had a very nice office and like a very nice part of town, and everything seemed very nice. But I remember coming out feeling very hurt after only half an hour, and she treated it like I was she literally used the words, this is like the abstract of a book. And I was like, well, no, it's not. It's my life. It's not the abstract of a book. It just all felt very bizarre. And she just made a comment about, she said to me, I don't think that you're close to your true self. And this was after half an hour of meeting me. And I took that completely to heart and really personally, and it really made me feel so upset because I feel like the experiences that I've been through, the abuse, the torture, is like the exact consequence of that is that you don't feel close to your true self, because your true self is ripped out of you by those experiences. It's completely fragmented and split into parts. So I mean, it's like she's accusing me of something that I can't even help. That's something that was done to me. That is the whole point of why I would be in therapy.
It's quite possible, and in fact very likely, that she was again projecting. I think this is the big problem with therapists, and although I admire a lot of Freud's work, I think he very brilliantly encapsulates this problem, and that is that Freud said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Of course, Freud smoked cigars, so essentially I feel like what he was saying is this stuff, these projections, displacements, these theories, they apply to you, they don't apply to me. And I do think that's often the therapeutic position. That is that a therapist often doesn't reflect on their own behaviour and the possibility that they themselves might be subject to the very forces, confusions, processes of denial that they claim to observe in the patient. That's why I feel like the dynamic itself is problematic, because it assumes that the therapist is in a position whereby they can essentially reach in and pull you out, but often the therapist isn't themselves out.
Absolutely. It seemed like that. Yeah. It seemed like that.
I was in this cafe the other day, and this experience was strange for many reasons, but there was a female being sat at the back of the cafe, and then this haggard sort of looking man came in, hunched over. I immediately thought there's something troubling this person, and he sat down with this female being, and I realised after a few minutes that they were having a therapy session. I mean, it was strange that they were having it in a cafe in the open, but anyway, that's one aspect. And he was late for the meeting. And then she said, "Why are you late?" and started making notes. And he started describing how he'd missed various forms of transport. And myself, as someone who has an interest in depth psychology, I immediately thought unconscious expression of anger. I thought, this guy's late because he's angry. And then I was going to listen some more, but I just thought, this is so heavy. This guy probably, and although I'm making like a lot of quick judgments, I thought this guy's angry at his therapist. So I kind of put my headphones in, because I didn't want to get deeply involved in this thing. And then after a while, towards the end of their conversation, I took them out, and he started telling this story about a piece of short fiction that he was writing for a writing class. And for me, this story was a metaphor, a very clear metaphor for abuse, that he was trying to express the fact that he'd been abused. And again, the therapist, the alleged therapist, sat opposite him, started taking notes, and she seemed very dispassionate. And I noticed she didn't ask him any questions about the story or the reason why he wrote it. I felt like she was missing out on a huge chunk of his inner world. As she walked away, I could see, as she left the cafe, because she left before him, that she had this look of distaste on her face, as if she hadn't enjoyed the meeting at all, as if she felt obligated to meet this individual. Obviously, I'm reading a lot into the body language here, but I think it was significant. I just thought, man, this guy seems so troubled, and he's talking to someone who doesn't want to listen. So yeah, of course, because I'm I don't know what you'd call it, like a guerrilla therapist. Maybe that's not the right word. I think because I sometimes see myself in those who have been hurt, and because I wanted to do something, I walked up to the guy and I said to him, I listened to some of the conversation you had with the therapist, and it reminded me of the things I said to my therapist when I was struggling to be heard. I said to him, I said those things because I was abused as a kid. I said, I don't know if that happened to you, but if it did, then you should find someone who wants to talk about that. Not someone who doesn't. He looked bewildered, but kind of affected by it. He didn't say anything, and I said, have a good day, and I walked away. I didn't want to get any more deeply involved in that, but I felt like, wow, how many people in this city and other cities are going to talk to people who are supposed to be listening to them, who are just doing it out of an obligation because they get money for it, who don't have any deep interest in that individual or their inner world, and really unconsciously do not want to talk about the problem. And I feel like the problem so often is early patterns of behaviour that were established often in the family, and so rarely I think therapists want to talk about that. I think there's a big fascination with cognitive behavioural therapy, and I think there's a big fascination with concepts like mindfulness. Now, I don't want to discount these methods, but for me they often seem to be ways of treating symptoms in the present instead of looking at the origin of the problem. To use an analogy, I think a lot of the therapies that are popular today mop up the blood from the wound and keep mopping up the blood from the wound. Whereas I think what a lot of people need to do is to go into the wound and pull the bullet out. But that process is one, I think, that requires love on behalf of the other person you're participating in that process with. And I think it's also a process that puts you in direct confrontation with the taboos of our societies. So I feel like there's a big problem with therapy. But I hope that information's coming out about this. I listened to a great talk by Gabor Mate on the Russell Brand podcast, which I recommend everyone listen to. He's an addiction specialist who works in a clinic in Vancouver, and I think he really has a very strong handle on this, and he articulates really beautifully what the problem is here.
Yeah, I feel like in this podcast with Gabor Mate, he just makes it so clear, the links, and it seems so obvious when he says it like that. Made me cry because I just thought it was so kind and so warm-hearted, and just to make this link between seriously affected individuals who are struggling with addiction and trauma. He made that link so clear.
I just also wanted to mention Alice Miller, who's written a series of amazing books. She was a therapist and she turned against psychotherapy as soon as she determined that there was a very strong link between childhood conditioning and psychological problems later in life. She abandoned the psychology community. She disavowed therapy entirely because she felt like there was too much of a power dynamic within the therapeutic relationship. There was too much potential for wounded therapists. The possibility of wounded therapists harming their patients was too great. She felt the dynamic itself was flawed and that it should be evolved. I wanted to ask if you had any positive therapy experiences. I was curious about any therapies that perhaps encompassed more than just talking, things like massage or body work, or things that you've done yourself.
I feel like the best therapy's been like the sauna. The sauna seems to help me a lot in a very gentle way, like aware of the body. I feel like it's a good place for meditating. Yoga has helped, but very gently. Running has helped a lot. I think just doing things that get you in touch with the physical body always help. And then I think drawing and analysing dreams has helped a lot. Like definitely analysing dreams, because that, I think, tells you so much about what's really going on in your mind rather than what's happening consciously during the day.
Yeah, I agree. I'm broadly of the Jungian perspective and Freudian perspective, with many, many caveats. And that is that I do believe that there's a huge volume of material lurking in the subconscious. And that really is the material that needs to be processed. And
also through art, and I guess any art, can just bring about realizations. It just actively changes you, I feel.
Do you feel like the best therapy is self-therapy, and that perhaps the entire concept of going to a therapist for help is a symptom of abuse, as in we were conditioned to believe that some external authority had the solution to our problems. And so in seeking a solution to the problems caused by external authority, we then look for another external authority and end up in this sort of nightmarish loop of looking for someone else to save us. Whereas the fundamental problem is that we were not allowed to expand our self-volition. We were not allowed to understand that we have the resources within us to heal ourselves. In a sense, we've been bred to have a dependency on external authority figures, and the very act of looking for a therapist, finding one and going to them is itself a repetition of the original problem, which is that someone else in a position of authority with a certificate is going to solve this problem for me.
I'm starting to feel that way, yeah, because I've had so many disappointing experiences with therapists now, and it just feels like it's so easy there to go back to a therapist that resembles the abuser, or resembles, in my case, my mother, and like felt like some kind of pattern of maybe my mother would comfort me sometimes, but she was also a very dangerous person to be around, and it feels like that pattern has repeated in the therapy sessions, which actually leads to more instability.
Yeah, I think there's a big problem with therapy in that we pay for it as well. So there's a transaction in a sense, whereas I think the original problem in childhood for me and for many people was that there was a transaction, that love was not given unconditionally. And in a sense, the payment that I made for occasionally receiving affection and care as a kid was to keep quiet about the sexual abuse. There was a transaction, as in we'll feed and clothe you if you keep silent about the sexual abuse. I feel like there's a parallel with the
Absolutely.
therapeutic relationship where you go to a therapist and they say essentially, I'll love and care for you occasionally if you
give
pay
me
me.
money. I think it's a very strange concept, and I mean, I was reflecting on this recently, and really maybe self-therapy is the best way, and you should be able to talk about your things that are affecting you, your life, with the people around you that love and care about you and would listen to you because they care about you, and not receive anything. It's not a transaction, it's just care and support, and I think that's a more natural way of things happening.
Could be that those with power and authority have fractured our societies to the extent that we don't really have this sense of community anymore, and then the function that community would have served by giving us a place to talk and express our feelings and communicate is now being outsourced to strangers called therapists.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that a lot of the time, just in different, I think people find it strange, or it's uncommon to talk about your feelings in a way.
Yeah, do you feel like therapy might be the monetization of social disconnection?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this with art as well. Like, this is kind of a bit of a side topic, but yeah, I mean, I just don't see a connection between art and money, or therapy or love and money. And I think in an ideal world, maybe these things would just be separate. I guess more for like Grundeinkommen, like
a universal basic income.
Yeah.
I would agree. I think I'd like to add at this point that not all of my experiences in therapy have been negative. I did have some good therapeutic experiences. I had one very positive experience with a therapist in London who hadn't gone through the traditional therapeutic route, and he had trained as a computer programmer, and I think his approach to therapy was very different. He regarded me as, I think, although I never quizzed him on it, I believe he regarded me on a very systemic level as a self-construct based in language, and that through my use of language he could unravel what it was that I'd been programmed with. I think he regarded me as a very sophisticated computer system. And I think, although that might sound like a slightly cold perspective, I think he was quite a warm-hearted individual who set strong boundaries but seemed really to listen. He really listened to me. I think he was the first person I'd ever met who really listened, and I don't know if that was a function of his training or simply who he innately was through his own experiences, but he really listened, and I think that made a big difference. It was transactional. I did pay him. He was actually one of the cheapest therapists that I ever had. He was also the best because he actually listened, and I think that quality was absent in so many people around me, and he had it, and I think it made sense to me to pay him for his time. I think he was a rare gem amongst a battlefield of haggard, broken individuals claiming to be therapists. I also had a very good therapist in California who was very bodywork based. So instead of working in the language form and instead of working through talk therapy, although there were aspects of that, she essentially used the methods outlined in a book called Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine, which describes the concept that animals in the wild, when they're faced with a traumatic experience, they either respond with a fight, flight, or freeze response. The theory runs that as kids, we often employ the freeze response, and so the therapeutic unraveling and resolution of those experiences is to go back into that freeze response and release what would have been used, the energy that would have been used for fight or flight. If you're new to that theory, that might sound like strange, wild, new information, but I recommend that book by Peter Levine. Again, I feel like I was very lucky to find a therapist who was authentically compassionate, who genuinely listened, who really cared about me as an individual, and who was also really prepared to hear my story, because like you said, it felt like many therapists don't want to talk about the slightest aspects of trauma. They're much more fascinated by what's happening in the present because it's much easier to deal with. It's much easier to talk about someone who has a stressful job and how they can use mindfulness to address that than to understand why has that person got a stressful job. And when you ask that question, I feel like it leads back to childhood conditioning and often to trauma. I wondered if you had any advice for people who are looking for a therapist. Perhaps the advice is don't do it.
Yeah.
Or do you think there is?
I don't have any advice for people looking for a therapist because I haven't found a therapist that will help me. So I have no advice to give anyone else. Yeah.
I mean, the advice I would give is it's an absolute minefield out there. It's absolutely a minefield. It's full of priests, gurus, shamans who have certificates on the wall, who are denying their own pain, who are looking for some way to make money or to outsource the expression of that pain in someone else. I know that sounds like quite a devastating verdict on the therapeutic industry, but I do feel like it's quite fair. I think my advice would be for anyone looking for a therapist is go into that search experience in the full knowledge that you've walked into a town full of pirates. You've literally walked into a town full of pirates. Most of them are hiding knives down the back of their shirts. You know, they'll get you drunk and steal all your money. This is who we're dealing with, really. However, amongst those pirates, there's a Captain Jack Sparrow, and you might find that individual. You might find the pirate who is warm and compassionate and does have a genuine interest in healing you. I think the danger in looking for a therapist without that perspective, without knowing just how wild and unruly they are as a bunch, is that you will be exploited. You will be exploited unless you're wide awake. And I think the danger is so many people who go into that pirate town are already extremely vulnerable. They're very desperate. Often people seek therapy at their lowest point, at the point at which they're least able to see who around them is likely to exploit them. So yeah, my advice would be very, very aware. Be very aware what you're getting into, and be aware that certification doesn't really mean anything. The size of the office and the beauty of the decor means very little. And as my experience was, the cheapest therapist was the best. Again, that's hardly a rule, but I do think it's a weird paradox, because I feel like the skill set that an individual requires in order to find a good therapist only comes out of a deep connection with themselves. And if they don't have that deep connection, which is likely because they're seeking therapy, then it's a really, really very difficult realm to tread.
Yeah. I feel like you've been the best therapist.
Oh, thanks. Likewise. I also feel like I've been the best therapist to myself, and maybe you feel the same about yourself. Do you?
Maybe.
I just wanted to finish by asking if there are any books that you recommend, because I found in my own healing process, actually the best therapists for me have been people who weren't even in the same room. So some of my favourite therapists were Gabor Mate, who was on the Russell Brand podcast the other day. He's written some great books like The Body Says No. Alice Miller, I think, was an excellent therapist. Although she disavowed therapy, her books themselves are so healing and so eye-opening.
Absolutely. I think it's just, sometimes it is just a bit of luck. I think who you find, I have a good friend, Annie, in London. She trained to be a doctor, and she's very kind person, and she listens, and she doesn't, she's very unusual for a doctor because she questions it all the time, and she doesn't have these assumptions that she knows best or anything like that, and she was quite like willing to accept alternatives, and I feel like she was a very good therapist in a sense. So
I was curious, were there any books that you felt stood out as titles that helped you heal?
The Courage to Heal.
I read that book also. What was it that you felt was useful about that?
I mean, that one was very helpful because I came to it just having a sense that I had been abused. There's a section at the beginning which lists all the symptoms, and I had almost every one, and I felt like it was very clear then to identify, and just was a good starting point. I really enjoyed
The Courage to Heal as well. I found it very powerful in my healing process. It's quite comprehensive in terms of, like you say, listing the symptoms that those who've experienced sexual abuse are facing, and it goes through the entire spectrum of experiences that a survivor of abuse will go through, including things like confronting the abuser or not confronting, and aspects of the healing journey. Is a really great book. It's gone through several revisions, and I would definitely place that towards the top of the list. If any listeners are interested in some more book recommendations, if you check out the website at karmapolice.earth, we'll put links to these books in the show notes.